Now I want to turn from talking about stereotypes, the cognitive component of prejudice, to talking about discrimination, the behavioral component. Discrimination, obviously, we might want to define it quickly: negative or harmful action toward a person because of their group membership. So, anything negative that you might be doing just because of what category you're placing somebody in. And we're going to get to the idea that there are different kinds of discrimination, some of them that are on the individual level, and some of them that are on the more macro level. But to start talking about discrimination, I want to continue talking about some ideas from the stereotype content model. So remember that we have these different sort of quadrants: high warmth, high competence; low warmth, low competence; high warmth, low competence; and high competence, low warmth. And those different combinations of how we feel about different groups have predictable outcomes. They all elicit different types of emotions, and those different dimensions elicit different types of actions. So, Cuddy, Fisk, and Glick followed up on some of their prior work, coming up with the just wonderfully named bias map. Bias being a relevant word, but also a useful acronym: behaviors from intergroup, affect, and stereotypes. So what they're doing is thinking about how warmth and competence might have different predictions for your behavior, but also that these predictions are tied up with the way that we feel about different groups. So remember we talked about the primacy of warmth briefly a little bit, that warmth is, is this a friend or foe, basically? That's the first thing that you need to figure out about other groups. So because warmth is more primary, the behaviors that have to do with the warmth dimension tend to be more active, that you might actively help groups that are high warmth and friendly, and you might actively harm or at least stand in the way of groups that are less warm or less friendly. Then we also have behaviors that are predicted from competence. These would be more passive behaviors because they're not, quite as important as the warmth behaviors. So passive facilitation, that you're allowing groups that have high competence to succeed and do whatever they're interested in doing. Passive harm, might be things that are more like neglect or just not dealing with the needs of that particular group. So those different dimensions, are predicting how we treat these different groups. But each quadrant also has a unique set of emotions that come with it. The groups that are high warmth and high competence are ones we tend to admire. The groups that are high competence and low warmth are groups that we tend to envy, that we are jealous of their success because they are high competence, but they're not friendly to us. Groups that we might pity are ones that are high in warmth but low in competence. Groups that can't fend for themselves necessarily, but are friendly or at least inert in some way. Then in the low competence, low warmth area, we end up having contempt, where we just don't like those groups in general. We're going to stand in their way, and we're going to actively get in the way of them. So these combinations lead to different types of behaviors that we're going to have towards these different groups. There's not going to generally be discrimination against the groups we admire and hold as high warmth and low competence, but the groups that we pity, we might passively harm them. So, groups like people with disabilities, the elderly. These might be groups that we, think of as not capable, and we passively harm them by maybe neglecting them, by not treating their needs, by not, visiting people in a nursing home or something like that. The envied groups are going to get active harm. We're going to erect ways for them, to not succeed on purpose, but then, we might allow them to succeed in some other ways, like how there are certain ethnic minority groups in the United States that are successful in, like, let's say, business, and we might actively try to stay in their way, but also like allow certain successes. And the groups in contempt are going to get the short end of the stick in both ways. They're going to be actively harmed and passively harmed. So this tends to be a really useful way to think about the emotional reactions that we have to groups and how those emotional reactions are tied to the ways that we treat them. Moving on to like different views of discrimination, maybe a more basic one. Gordon Allport, someone we've talked about repeatedly in his book, The Nature of Prejudice, he talks about different levels of discrimination that kind of go up in terms of severity, I guess. So, I kind of did the reverse of this at the beginning of these lectures, right? That we, might kind of brush off jokes and stuff like that as verbal prejudice. But when you get further on, avoiding groups, excluding them from, parts of life, and then finally violence or even extermination, there are different levels to these, but they're all tied into the same sorts of cognitive and emotional processes. And the exact things that we end up doing might be predicted by, things like we just talked about on the bias map. Another way that we might want to break down types of discrimination is through blatant, subtle, and covert discrimination. So blatant discrimination is, I think, what comes to most people's minds when you think of discrimination. They're generally intentional things. They're easy to spot. They're easy to document. And depending on what the group is and the historical time you're in, they might be illegal and socially condemned, but not always. So examples of blatant discrimination from our own history in the United States, groups being not allowed to vote, like women and people of color not having the vote for an incredibly long time in our history, or people, not being able to use restrooms or water fountains based on the color of their skin. These are things that we might hold up as blatant discrimination and use as counterexamples to say that, there's more freedom today than there used to be. But really, this just tends to be that these things are not really less common, they're not absent. They may be less common, but really it's that when a group becomes more accepted, or the type of discrimination against a group becomes more like normatively frowned upon, then we don't just stop having prejudice and discrimination against different groups. We kind of send it underground towards like subtle and covert discrimination. And it doesn't mean that blatant discrimination is gone. Blatant discrimination ends up just shifting to different groups. It used to be more acceptable to have blatant forms of discrimination against women and black people. And now, for example, that tends to be less normatively acceptable. So it moves on to people like illegal immigrants or Muslims or trans people. So the targeted groups change, but blatant discrimination tends not to go away. So the issues might change, but the problems are still there. When blatant discrimination for particular groups might go underground, like I said, it might shift to a subtler type of discrimination. So these things are generally not as visible and obvious, and they might be harder to document, and they might also be unintentional. They might not be things people are doing on purpose, but they might be kind of baked into the norms of a society and the institutional structures going on. A lot of times there's deniability or ambiguity going on here, and I want to talk a little bit about, when and how and why that might be. I've talked a little bit about subtle discrimination through language already. I talked about, using black rapper versus white rapper, male nurse versus female nurse. The way that we discriminate against groups is kind of baked into our language. And things like hostile humor, being patronizing to people in lower status groups, emphasizing the differences between groups, can all be ways that we, might engage in this kind of subtle discrimination that, may seem like a problem that you can brush off, but over time, that really adds up for the groups that are being discriminated against and reinforces the existing inequities in our society. I usually at this point, if we were in person, I would show a video here. I'm not going to play the whole thing right now because you can watch it on your own. I put it on the bonus content for the Prejudice unit. I'll just kind of start it here and pause, but you can see that it's just a split screen basically. And throughout the video, you're going to see basically a black and white person going through the same things, applying for a job, getting pulled over by the police, trying to buy a house, trying to buy a car, and how there are inequitable outcomes for all of these different things. And it's pretty, it's probably not news for anyone, but it's still kind of powerful to see all these outcomes. And, this is far from the only set of outcomes that are discriminatory for blacks and whites or other groups in the United States, but seeing these comparisons in a stark way, I think is really powerful. So if you did watch the video, I mean, maybe pause it and watch it if you'd like. But there was one study where that they cover where researchers sent out resumes to real employers, and they gave the same credentials, but they were all had like a stereotypically white or stereotypically black first name. And resumes with the black names were only half as likely to get a call back for an interview as the white names. So why might this be? Jack Davidio and Sam Gertner wanted to study this a little bit, so they gave white participants the kind of same stimuli as they actually sent out to these real employers previously. So they had perfectly equal resumes, and randomly assigned the participants to view one or the other, and they shifted one aspect of this. They manipulated the qualifications of the candidates. They were either clearly unqualified, weakly qualified, clearly qualified, strongly qualified, or ambiguously qualified. It wasn't really clear if they should be hired or interviewed or not. And they just wanted the participants to rate the hireability of these people. And when there are really clear signals going on, when the person is very strongly, clearly qualified, the hireability perceptions for black and white applicants are not different. They're both high. When they are clearly unqualified, it's the opposite, that their hireability is low, and it still is relatively even for white and black people. But when the qualifications are ambiguous, that's where you see discrimination coming out. That the perceptions of hireability are almost twice as high for the white candidates as the black candidates. And Davidio and Gertner have a big program of research capitalizing on this sort of outcome, that it's when cues are ambiguous and the social norms are not clear that racism in this case, but prejudice in general, is going to come out. So they call this idea aversive racism, that we all have kind of ambivalent views and attitudes towards groups. And in general, people don't want to be prejudiced, right? People want to be egalitarian. People want to think that they treat others equally. But we know also, as we've talked about, we understand the stereotypes that are out there about different groups. They're part of the social ether that we swim around in all the time. So generally, people are going to try to avoid that stuff. But when the cues are ambiguous, when it's not clear what to do in a situation, that is when discriminatory behaviors are going to pop up, like not hiring someone for a job. So you can have all of the initiatives you want to interview more diverse candidates, for example, but when you then interview a bunch of equally qualified candidates, more often than not, a hiring committee is going to pick the white candidate generally, or the man over the woman, because it's in those ambiguous situations where there's not a clear answer. If you have a bunch of qualified candidates, who are you going to pick? Well, it's going to go to the majority group member more often than not. Another way that discrimination kind of goes underground or can be expressed in subtle ways is an idea called symbolic racism. So Don Kinder and David Sears started studying this in the late 60s and early 70s. And basically it was because they, if you ask people really straightforward, hey, do you think black people are inferior? Questions like that, people don't say yes to those things, but people still do have those negative attitudes about blacks. So symbolic racism was invented to be basically a blend of those anti-black ideas with individualist and Protestant work ethic type American moral values. So the types of items that might be on there are it's really a matter of some people not trying hard enough. If blacks would only try harder, they could be just as well off as whites. So if you endorse that idea, you have some kind of deniability there. You could say you endorse that because it's more tied up in, well, I just think people should get up on their own efforts and pull themselves up by their bootstraps. I'm not racist. But if all these 8 items you are agreeing with them or disagreeing with them in a certain direction, then we can be relatively confident that you have these racially resentful or symbolically racist views. And you'll notice that some of these things are reverse coded. The first, and I meant to put on the last one, is reverse coded. If you agreed with these two, the first and last ones more, then you would be less symbolically racist. But using these measures of symbolic racism, Kinder and Sears were able to show that when there are black candidates in elections, like in the Los Angeles mayoral elections in 69 and 73, Thomas Bradley, the black candidate, was the strongest predictor for vote choice for him was this symbolic racism measure, even above ideology. And you might be thinking, well, that was a long time ago. Maybe that doesn't happen anymore. Well, if you look at racial resentment in elections for when Barack Obama was involved, suddenly we have a black candidate. Well, again, racial resentment then becomes very, very important. And because Donald Trump ran a campaign in 2016, more analysis needs to be there for 2020, but it's probably very similar results. That if race is a thing on people's minds, then it's going to matter for an election. And then there's something called racial spillover, or the spillover of racialization that is also kind of very important to political attitudes. That because Obama was a relevant political figure that happened to be black, people's racial attitudes being connected to Obama then became connected to his policies, for example. So although your attitudes about healthcare plans or taxes shouldn't have anything to do with race, people's attitudes about race did matter for people's attitudes towards those things just because Obama kind of connected the dots for them. And this can even go to things beyond his exact policies. Like I've shown in a paper before that racial resentment in 2008, 2012 predicted how fair you think elections are in the United States, and that had never been a pattern before 2008. And really interesting study. Michael Tesler, the person that kind of spearheaded this spillover of racialization idea, he did a study where he randomly assigned people to give ratings about a dog and either told them that it was Obama's dog or Ted Kennedy's dog. They did both happen to have the same kind of dog. So that was why. It's Portuguese water dog. So if people thought it was Ted Kennedy's dog, then their racial attitudes had nothing to do with how they felt about this dog. But if they thought it was Obama's dog, then people that were more symbolically racist liked the dog less. So racism can spill over into other things in subtle ways that we are not even always aware of.